In this video, I'll show you how you can use a particular event to launch a program, and in the next video I'll talk about how one program can launch another by calling it. Before I get into events, I want to say something about the .NET framework. I'm going to create a new project, and I want you to notice that when I'm creating a Windows Forms application, I have a couple of choices. There's this one here, Windows Forms app, and further down the list there's another, Windows Forms app .NET framework. So what's the difference? Well, to understand the difference, I need to say something about the .NET framework. You'll hear the .NET framework defined as a developer platform, but what does that mean? Well, it's called a framework because it provides a basic structure for your application. Imagine a construction site where lots of houses are being built. Each house might start with the same basic shell, some concrete foundations and a timber frame. In fact, the timber frame might come in pre-made sections that are assembled on site. But as the work progresses, the houses become very different from each other. The .NET framework is similar. .NET is a collection of programming languages and code libraries. It contains various project templates with lots of code already written into them. So, for example, you don't have to code up a Windows form from scratch. Nor, for example, do you have to code up your own message box command from scratch. The code libraries already contain a message box command, ready for the programmer to use. And much of this is taken care of behind the scenes. It's hidden from view. Well, most of the time. So coming back to the difference, Windows Forms app .NET framework comes with more code libraries, more facilities. Windows Forms app without .NET framework in brackets is also referred to as the Windows Forms app .NET Core. It's lightweight, it contains less built-in code. And if you select this project template, you may find that there are some facilities not available to you. It has its place, but if you're a beginner or an intermediate programmer, I strongly recommend you use Windows Forms app .NET framework. This one. I'm calling my project Events because that's what this is all about. So, as I said, I've already got a form which I can start building on. This is the framework for my new application. I'm going to pop a couple of buttons onto the form. And let's resize the form a little bit as well. Now normally I would strongly recommend that you rename those buttons as you place them onto the form, but I'm going to stick with the names Button 1 and Button 2 for now. I'll double click Button 1 so I can write some code. Now I just want to draw your attention to something which has to do with the .NET framework. Notice how it says One Reference at the top of this module. I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to double click here. All of a sudden I can see a lot of code which I didn't write. This has come from the .NET framework. Most of the time I don't need to concern myself with what's going on here, but if you come across it, you shouldn't be intimidated by it. Let's take a look down here. I can see some code which is creating the button objects, and then those buttons are being drawn onto the form with a particular size. I can also see the names of the buttons being set. This saves me a lot of work. But I do strongly recommend you don't change it. For example, you wouldn't just go knocking down a wall inside a house. It might be a supporting wall, and you could end up bringing the ceiling down. It's the same here. Leave this code alone until you're an advanced user and you understand what's going on. The code I'm working on is still here, on the second tab along. And the form design itself is on this tab. I don't need to see this code, which is normally hidden, so I'm just going to close this tab down. Something else I get from the .NET Framework are a load of references to code libraries, and I can see them over here in the Solution Explorer. If I just expand references, each of these is a DLL file. And again, when you're an advanced user, these will make more sense to you. For now, suffice to say, these are giving me the programming facilities which I'm going to use. So, let's talk about event handling and events. I'll start with some simple code which will run when I click on button number 1. Make sure it works. And that's fine. And of course, button 2 doesn't do anything at all. The program I've just written is called an event handler because it's handling the click event of button 1. Now let's take a closer look at this line. There's a lot of stuff on here I don't actually need. The word sub is short for sub procedure. This is a sub procedure because my application could consist of lots of procedures. I need the word sub, but I don't need the word private in front of it. I'm going to get rid of that. The program will still work. The private keyword controls the scope or the visibility of this procedure, and I'll talk more about scope later on. It so happens that the default scope of this sub-procedure is private, so I don't actually need the private keyword. It's private anyway. The second thing, which I don't actually need, for this particular procedure anyway, is this stuff in brackets. These are called parameters, and I'll be saying a lot more about parameters later. These parameters can be very useful, but I don't need them now, so I can get rid of them. In fact, if I delete all of this, including the brackets will come back as soon as I move off the line. Let's see if it still works. No problem. But there's one thing here that I absolutely do need if I want this program to run when I click on the button. It's this handles clause which is creating the linkage between this sub-procedure and the button itself. If I remove it altogether, I now have a sub-procedure which I can't launch, at least not with the button. Let's take a look. Nothing at all. So I'm going to put the handles clause back. I need it. And that will work again. Something interesting about the handles clause is I can actually use it to handle the click event of more than one object. So for example, if I want the same program to run when I click on button 2, I can simply do this. So my event handler is now going to handle the click event of both buttons. Let's see. Button 1 and button 2. This might not strike you as particularly useful right now, but as you get more advanced, you'll find that this can be incredibly useful under some circumstances. For now, I'm just going to handle the click event of button 1. You might have spotted a few moments ago that there are lots of different events associated with this button. Let me just backspace out click and retype the full stop. These are some events which I can choose from. For example, I could use the mouse move event to trigger this program. When the cursor moves over the button, the program runs. Indeed, any movement of the cursor over the button will trigger that program. Another example is the mouse leave event. I've just moved the cursor over the button, but watch what happens when it moves away from the button. It triggers the code. You can see there are quite a few mouse-related events here. Here's something different. the key press event. I'm putting my cursor over the button and then I'm going to tap any key on the keyboard, and that triggers the key press event. A mouse click doesn't do anything. A word of warning. Some of the events that you see listed here won't work. Not for a button anyway. For example, a button doesn't have a double click event. This really shouldn't be in the list. But it's there as a consequence of a principle known as inheritance. Arguably, this is a design fault of VB.NET. Until you're more familiar with the various events that apply to a button, there's a better way to select the one you need. I'm going to remove this program, go back to the Form Designer, and with the button selected, I'm going to use the Properties window to choose the event I want. Notice at the top of the Properties window, there's a little lightning bolt. This represents events. If I click on that, I can see all of the events which will work with the button. Notice that double click isn't in there. But let's try mouse up. That's the event I want, so I can just double click it and I've got the procedure stub which I need. Now I've already told you I don't need the private keyword and I don't actually need the stuff in brackets just yet. More about them later. But notice that the handles clause specifies that this program is going to handle the mouse up event, whatever that is. Run the program. Moving my cursor over the button isn't doing anything. I'm going to press down on my left mouse button. Nothing's happening, but when I let go of the button, the mouse up event is fired. Now let's look at some of the events of the form itself. I'm going back into the design view and I'm going to make sure that the form is selected. So I'm clicking away from the button onto the background of the form. Notice where these drag handles are. So in the Properties window, as long as I have the events selected, I can see form events. Some of the most useful ones include load and paint. Let's try the load event. A double click brings me back into the code, and notice this is handling mybase.load. Mybase is just another way of saying this particular form. When I run my application, before the form is displayed on the screen, it is loaded into memory, and that's the event which is being handled here. Once the form has been loaded into memory, it can then be painted onto the screen. Let's write some code for the paint event. Double click in the Properties window. I have the procedure stub I need. This time we're handling mybase.paint. And this code will run immediately after the form appears on the screen. There's the load event handler firing, and then the form's paint event fires. Now I've got into a bit of a mess here, because when the paint event fires, it displays a message box on the screen. When I dismiss the message box, the form is repainted, which fires the form's paint event, which displays a message box. But at least I can force my way out of this. It's a bad idea to use the paint event of the form to display message boxes on the screen. There's one more form event which I should mention now. Let's get rid of this first. It's the form closing event. This particular event will fire while the form is being closed. We also have a form closed event which will fire after the form has been closed. These are particularly useful if you want to save some data which has been captured by the form when the form is being closed down. You'll find out more about these in a later video. In the meantime, you might like to play around with these various form events, or the events that come with a button. or even a text box.